go.
Hi there, we are the Cult of Conversation. Welcome to our show. I'm Chad Schmidt, the Mennonite atheist, and we have someone we want to interview today, and we're looking forward to having another good conversation.
So I'm Craig Shoemake, and I have here a colleague of mine from work, actually, Leanna House. And she is the mother of a podcast and a blog, and she's done some interesting things. And she actually grew up Mormon, but is sort of kind of no longer Mormon.
Oh, definitely no longer Mormon.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I didn't know how far out there I should go, but yeah, so I don't want to piss off the millions of Mormons that are watching us, so
I mean, there's probably like dozens.
Well, it's a matter of how many people are actually watching us, which is at this point not that many.
Our audience is huge. Huge.
That's how it starts.
Anyway, so we wanted to kind of just learn about your I call it well, I guess ordinarily people would say faith journey, but in this case, maybe it's the faithless journey or journey into faithlessness and beyond or whatever. So basically, I guess we can start off with a potted bio, tell us about yourself and how you got from there to here.
Okay. That's like, I don't even know that answer to that question, but I was born in rural Utah, Bluffdale, Utah, to be specific. Wow. My parents were both very faithful Mormons and Mormon hippies. So this is like the 70s when they got married. And my mom came from several generations of Mormonism. But my dad was a new-ish convert. Like he converted himself when he was like 9. But my mom was a very faithful Mormon and my dad like really, really got into it. So they were Mormon hippies trying to live off the land, do the food storage that you're required to do as a Mormon, preparing for the apocalypse because that's what you do. So I grew up on a 3-acre piece of property. We didn't live off the land, but like maybe 30% of our food came from our own sources. And I just grew up where this is normal and in the middle of, Mormon country. And I didn't realize until I moved to Arizona, which also has a high proportion of Mormons, but it wasn't until I moved there that I was like, oh, not everyone is Mormon. And I was like 12 years old at this point. Like I was 12 years old before I realized that not everyone was Mormon. So that was like kind of a revelation. And I went through high school in Utah. I went to Brigham Young University for my undergraduate. And then I got into graduate school in Orlando, Florida. And it was really in Orlando, Florida that my disaffection began. And before I left for grad school, my stepmother, who's a lovely woman, said to me, I've heard people say that you can't be educated and a Mormon. Do you believe that? And I said, no, I can't believe like why that would be. Like there's so many educated Mormons. And after 2 years of grad school, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, no, you can't be an educated Mormon, which was a huge disappointment to my family. But I was lucky because when I left the Mormon church, I was the first one in my family. And that was like, I mean, I was really quiet about it and I was all the way in Florida and then I like went to Spain. So like no one knows what I'm doing. But it was easy to be far away and not a Mormon, but like the Mormons found me in Spain to like call me to repentance and in Florida too, obviously. And
someone sent you? Someone sent them to you?
Oh yeah, it was probably like someone in my family, like grandma or whatever. If you disappear as a Mormon, there's a whole department in Salt Lake City that has all of these steps about like call your last known address, like try to go through the post office, like Google, like there's this series of steps that you have to take. And one of them is like calling anyone that you're related to try to find you because you're a lost sheep now.
Wow. Hey,
I did not know that.
Before we get into this too far, I don't want to lose touch with your the need to hear a little bit more about your blog So that's your kind of an initial history, Mormon history. But what happened? What's outside of that you're doing?
Oh, I mean, a lot probably. A couple of years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And my mother, when I was 15, died of breast cancer. So, like, I've seen up close what cancer does. And then I got it myself at 33, which is really young, to get cancer. And I went through treatment. And when I went through treatment, I was looking for a podcast because when we get into like my Mormon disaffection, one of the huge supports for me was Mormon podcasts that go through all of these identity issues, all of these like the weird things that come up when you go through a disaffection, and the disaffected Mormon universe, damn you, has a bunch of podcasts to help you through that. So I looked for a podcast when I got cancer and it didn't exist. So I got a friend and I was like, let's do a podcast. And it's going pretty well. Like, we have a pretty big presence on social media, and we get like 2,500 listeners a week or something, which is
Wow,
insane.
good for you.
Like, like listening to me and Mimi talk about, like, I don't know, we swear a lot and complain, and but it's so yeah, that's what we're currently doing, and it's going well. We might have like some more, like, Thanks Cancer is the name of the podcast, by the way.
Thank you. Thanks, Cancer. All right.
Thanks Cancer, because I mean,
Yeah.
you're never gonna forget that.
No, no, that's a great name. Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when people hashtag Thanks Cancer, where they're like, oh, I've been throwing up for 3 days on chemo, and hashtag Thanks Cancer, and I'm like, you're welcome.
Yeah.
No sarcasm there.
Yeah, no, it's really good. That's really smart. Yeah, no, I like it.
But yeah, so we're gonna continue doing it as long as we're having fun, and maybe pivot into something else.
And how does the blog relate to that, Leanna? Did it come first, or did it come after you started the podcast?
I think it kind of, I blogged before I did the podcast.
Okay.
But I'm always like writing, so where do we draw those lines about blogging?
So you've been maintaining them both simultaneously then, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so yeah, that's been
And the blog is primarily cancer related, cancer issues, cancer thoughts, or whatever.
Yes. Yes.
Uh-huh.
We talk about, because I wanted to talk about like the things that people like, because everyone's talking about like what are the side effects of chemo, and that's like a huge snooze fest. Or everyone's talking about like, oh, well, tell me your cancer story, which is always the same goddamn cancer story, and it's boring. And like, I wanted to talk about like, what do we call ourselves and why, and like how language influences what you're going through, or like everyone going through cancer has like weird guilt and shame, like what is up with that? And so these
more
like,
the psychology of cancer than the actual
cancer survival, particularly.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah.
So that's been my last 3 years, kind of trying to work through that. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback. Like I get messages on the regular. People who were in the hospital will just like binge our episodes. And if I could make someone laugh with my like ridiculous cancer memes.
And mention to Chad about the thing you told me, how you may be out in California to do a show.
Oh,
Yeah, she's hitting the big time, possibly.
Like
Possibly.
look, I am not a believer until I see it, which we'll get into.
Right. Good
We might, like, we're in talks with Nestle. And there's an NDA associated with it, but maybe there will be some TV spots coming up, which like I would really love to be on TV talking about like cancer survivorship, because like when else can I do that? But also it's a global pandemic, so if I don't end up flying to California, I'll be okay with that.
Yeah.
So
right.
if I can interject something, I just kind of realized, Leanna, Eric Zhu, the work that he does, and the whole Perini group, that's all cancer survivorship.
Oh yeah, Eric and Christopher are my favorite. They're amazing.
So like, Chad, just to kind of let you know, I work at Dana. We work at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute together, and specifically, we work in the pediatric oncology department, and I manage, when people ask what I do, essentially I say that I basically manage money, that's research money for cancer research laboratories.
Oh, I see.
Because there's the science side, there's the PIs and what have you, the research techs, the postdocs who are doing the science. And then, of course, on the back end, someone's got to manage the funds that are supporting this. And that is a whole other operation. And Leanna is on the early end of that, and I'm on kind of the back end. That's what's known as pre-award, post-award. So she and I work together with a lot of the same researchers. And one group that I was assigned to recently after a colleague of ours left, this was last year, a guy named Peter Smith, wonderful fellow. He left, and I got this Perini group. And there's a whole bunch of researchers there, and what they are studying is cancer survivorship. So they're not actually trying to devise a cure for cancer. They're trying to help people maintain and develop quality of life in the aftermath of cancer. Okay. So they have like sleep studies. So Eric Zhu, for example, who we just mentioned, does studies on sleep disorders with Black women who have been afflicted with cancer. That's actually one of the studies going on.
He does really, really interesting work. I came to work at the cancer center in the middle of my treatment, which I would not recommend. Changing your job in the middle of cancer treatment is a terrible idea.
Yeah, so she actually got treatment at Dana-Farber, which is part of the link.
Kidding.
Yeah.
And I decided that exposure therapy was the way to go. So like, how do you cure cancer? All cancer all the time. I started a podcast. I went to work at the cancer center.
And you
know what? Let's lean into this.
Let's just go for it.
So that kind of gives you more of a background of our
Sure.
connection and what how it's all kind of linked up. And
Makes
like your
sense.
podcast and the blog is all about the stuff, essentially what the Perini group is doing.
Yeah,
on the science side of things. Yeah,
it is. It's everything's connected, Craig.
Well,
I learned that 40 years ago.
I'm looking forward to checking it out. That sounds awesome.
Okay, we swear a lot. It's funny.
I'm okay with it's just I'm anticipating laughing about cancer. That'll be interesting. I'm going to give it a shot.
It's hilarious.
Hilarious, yeah. So maybe we should go. All right, so let's kind of move into actually talking about, your belief history, the actual makeup of like
the content of your history.
So you mentioned that you were raised Mormon, and so I guess, if anybody wants to learn what Mormonism is, obviously they can go Google it, they can read the Book of Mormon, blah blah blah, but kind of tell us, like, how did this specifically impact your life? What did you really personally, genuinely believe? And then what maybe were the things that kind of started to challenge that? So I think I kind of envisioned, Chad and I, we were thinking out these questions, there's kind of like 3 stages we're thinking of here. It's like, the before, the during, the transition, what incentivized that, and then like where you're
at now,
where have you landed? Yeah, so like a 3-stage process, and take as much time.
Yeah,
if you digress too much, we'll kind of get you back on here until we've kind of fleshed that out, but feel free to just wax poetic. That's really the heart of the matter.
Interrupt me if I'm like, because this is my area of expertise. Like, I could talk for ages about this.
Well, that's what we want, honestly.
Yeah,
I'll just say up front, I really do want to hear this. This is this kind of stuff that Craig and I wanted to have on center stage from the get-go on this channel. So we're eager to hear it.
And Mormonism is way more fascinating now that I am not identifying as a Mormon.
Interesting.
Okay, so the before times was, I would say, up to and including like 21. So I grew up in a very typical Mormon home. I had 5 brothers and sisters, and everyone I know is a Mormon. My family is Mormon. I have like some aunts and some cousins that aren't Mormon, but like I am really in the enclave of Mormonism. And so when you were 8 years old as a Mormon, you were baptized into belief, and you like consent, right? But you're 8 years old, and this is like a rite of passage. So like you profess belief. And then the other thing to know about Mormonism, I mean, for people who know nothing about Mormonism, Mormonism considers itself a Christian religion, but a lot of Christians do not agree with that because Mormonism is pretty typically Christian, but does not adhere to the Nicene Creed, because according to Mormonism, there is like a whole cosmology that Christians disagree with about the origin of God and creation ex nihilo and all of that stuff. So
It's non-Trinitarian essentially, right? I mean, it's correct.
it's a what?
It's non-Trinitarian.
It is non-Trinitarian, that is correct. And
Maybe you want to define that?
God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Ghost are
Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So they're basically negating that, or they deny.
They're separate beings.
Yes, they're separate beings. And the other thing is that God, our God that we worship, used to be a mortal man who went through this process of being tested on earth, and he came out the other side being a god. And our goal is to go through this process of mortal life and come out being deity.
Divine. Yeah.
Okay, that I did not know.
Yeah, no, it like the doctrine.
That's news to me.
It's
Wow.
like Swedenborg mixed with
I was thinking.
Swedenborg.
Yeah, this is very Gnostic, mystical sort of.
There is some Gnostic influence there.
Yeah, I was not aware of that at all. Anyway, keep on going.
And the sacred text. So Mormons believe the Bible as far as it is translated correctly. So that gives you a nice get out of jail free card. And then in addition to that, they have the Book of Mormon, which is like 19th century fan fiction.
Yes, it is.
And it's kind of amazing. But
by fan, you mean fantasy or
it's like explaining the origins of the Native American Indians.
Okay.
And this was something that was like on the mind of popular people at the time.
I read about half of it, so I'm somewhat familiar with it.
And like a lot of it is stolen from View of the Hebrews, which was a book written by a priest, like a Methodist priest who had a connect. Anyway, so like it's super complicated. So the Book of Mormon, that Joseph Smith says was translated from golden plates that he can't show you because an angel took them back to heaven. This is a true story. It's hilarious. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
that always
my lost socks.
And then you have the Doctrine and Covenants, which is Joseph Smith's revelations. Like, so it's a lot of like administration of the church and calling people to ecclesiastical missions and stuff. It also contains a lot of the like litmus tests about Mormons. Like, for example, you know that Mormons can't drink coffee or tea, and they can't have alcohol, and all of that is in the Doctrine and Covenants. This kind of, but it's been interpreted differently throughout the years and whatever.
Sure.
And then you have the Pearl of Great Price, which is a book of scripture that Joseph Smith translated from a traveling salesman who was displaying mummies and the funerary texts that accompanied the mummies. And this is like 1842, 1840, maybe 1839, I'd have to look. And Joseph Smith was like, holy shit, you guys, this is fucking Moses. Like, Moses wrote this. So the church raised money to buy these funerary texts, and Joseph Smith translated, which after we found the Rosetta Stone, it turns out like
sorry,
I shouldn't at all, which is interesting.
Oh well, so much for that translation.
Okay, so I grew up believing all of these things and not really questioning. Because
were you? I'm sorry to interrupt. Were you actually familiar with their contents? How much of this stuff had you actually read, as opposed to just being kind of, spoon-fed little?
As a Mormon, you are required to read scripture. You're required to journal, and church is 3 hours on Sunday. Plus, you have a lot of activity. Like, being a Mormon takes a lot of time. Like, your time commitment to the church is like 20 hours a week. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot. And so I did. I had read like the Book of Mormon. And you also have classes as a teenager that in Utah, where it's called seminary or release time. So you leave the high school grounds and go to a building next door where you are taught, the Book of Mormon, or you're taught about church history, or you're taught about, whatever it is. But like, as a Mormon, this is baked into the Utah experience of, so you are actually reading the text, and you are reading the words of God. But like, Mormon theology is like, whew, they say it's like trying to nail Jello to the wall, is about
Right.
how like Mormon theology
That's
is.
hilarious. Yeah, good
But
metaphor.
it's it's amazing, but like bizarre. So, but most of it is taught to children, and is taught by the church itself, has been correlated. In the 1970s and 80s, the church had a department that like went through and kind of whitewashed everything. So like, everything is these simple stories instead of like the complicated historical reality.
The Reader's Digest version.
The Reader's Digest version, and also just the like the call and response in the church, and the lessons and the classes that you go to. Like, the answer to every question is like, oh, pray and read your scriptures. Like, it's more call and response, and like, what is it called when you repeat enough so that you believe it?
Mantra.
Yeah, it's mantric, a lot of it. And there are a lot of things that you say repetitively, like as a young woman growing up in the church. And by the way, like, the Mormon church is pretty conservative. So like, I was a very, very good Mormon until I was 21 years old. And I was way too outspoken. Like, I had a male at BYU tell me that he would not date me because I was not submissive enough. And he volunteered that information. I did not ask him why he wouldn't date me. He like,
Yeah.
he thought that I should know that I was not submissive enough to like be a part of this culture, which whatever, it's fine.
Man.
But as a Mormon woman growing up in the church, for 6 years, every Sunday, you say, it's like a pledge of allegiance, but it's, we are daughters of God who loves us and we love him. We will stand as witnesses of God at all times and in all things and in all places, as we strive to live the young women values, which are faith, divine nature, individual worth, knowledge, choice and accountability, good works and integrity. We believe as we come to accept and act upon these values, we will be prepared to make and keep sacred covenants, perform the ordinances of the temple, and reap the blessings of exaltation. I got a couple of words wrong in there, but like, you have a lot of these mantric sayings, and children learn the 12 articles of faith that were set out in the 1830s about, we believe in God, the eternal Father, and in his son, Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost. We believe, like, so there's a lot of, I would say, training for belief. I don't want to call it brainwashing, because it's not exactly brainwash. It's like brain spritzing, I would say, instead of brainwashing. But you also have a lot of, in the church lessons, you have a lot of built-in mental control mechanisms. Like, for example, you are taught that if you read something that makes you feel weird inside, that is God telling you that Satan is trying to lead you astray.
Right.
What would constitute weird?
So like, if I come across anti-Mormon literature that challenges my belief, and the cognitive dissonance makes me feel a certain way,
Discomfort.
That's God telling me it's true. Oh, and this is also like baked into the Mormon belief structure itself, because one of the big, if you are taught by Mormon missionaries, at the end of their lessons, they ask you to go through Moroni's promise. So at the end of the Book of Mormon, it says, if you ponder these things, and if you read this book, and if you pray to God, God will confirm that this church is true. But there's no, like, if you pray having real intent and faith in Christ, I think is the language of it. So, but there's no mechanism whereby you can have a feeling that this isn't true. If you
There's no way to disprove it, basically.
yeah, if you don't get the feeling that it's true, it's because you haven't prayed with real intent or having faith in Christ or whatever. It's always your fault, right?
Right.
So the belief structure is very baked into the experience, and especially for Mormon adults are obligated to wear sacred underwear. And I know this sounds like a joke. This sounds like a setup
No,
for
I've read about this. Yeah.
we should call them Jesus jammies.
I wasn't even aware of all this until like a year ago, actually.
It's amazing. But in terms of reinforcement of belief, it's a very great tangible reminder of your covenants that you've made in the temple.
Yeah,
And
right.
and people are it's so wrapped up in like protection and identity and self that a lot of Mormons ex-Mormons, have a visceral reaction, even though they don't believe anymore. Getting rid of their sacred underwear is really, really traumatizing. So the Mormon church does bake in making it easy for you to believe. And also like the lessons of the church are, have stories about disaffection, but it's, this person left because they were offended. And like, are you going to give up eternal salvation because someone doesn't like your hair? Like, it's totally minimized. And a lot of these stories that are told, if you go back and look at the historical precedent, like people were angry at Joseph Smith because Joseph Smith started a bank that wasn't a bank and everyone lost their shirt. But according to the Mormon lessons that you're given, it's people were offended by Joseph Smith and his
right.
They're offended by being built.
I mean, they were offended by fucking 14-year-olds also.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother story.
Hey, can I just ask, Leanna, the way you were talking about how they exploit your conscience, right? Because conscience is kind of culturally determined in a way, right? So you're born in a certain family, you're going to have one way of feeling bad about something, and in another family, you're going to feel bad for other things. I thought that was a very thoughtful description. Were you ever in Salt Lake City? Did you ever live there?
Yeah. So Bluffdale, Utah is a outskirt of Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City,
okay.
like 20 minutes north of Bluffdale, I guess, depending on traffic.
Bluffdale's where you grew up, right?
Bluffdale is where I grew up. But yeah, there's also only really one center of population density in Utah. Like everything's been like 100
all roads lead to Salt Lake.
everybody in Salt Lake, that my parents lived there. My dad was he's a priest, and he was a part of a seminary, a Christian seminary there, and lived there for years. So I've been there quite a few times. And
what did
one of the things that struck me, that reminded me of how you talked about how well integrated these ideas, how they get internalized. They become like features of who you are, and you don't know how to distinguish these ideas from your identity as a person. Well, in Salt Lake City, I noticed that everybody who wasn't a Mormon was Buddhist or something, and they were marketing it, right? You don't, so that there was a clear defining difference. But what struck me most deeply was how the road patterns were determined. So 0 Ave is the tabernacle, right? And so everywhere you go, you're 24 east and 35 south of, everywhere you are, your orientation, if you want to speak about where you are, you have to speak about it in reference to the temple. And it's just
a sacred geography. Basically.
Yeah, it's basically Augustine's city of God model.
Yeah.
Wherever you are, your orientation has a central point. And that's another way of integrate. It's just a geographical way of doing the same kinds of things you're describing. And does that sound reasonable to you? Does that make sense?
Yes. And I grew up at 16813, so I was pretty far away from the temple, which is maybe why I disaffected, right?
Yeah, right.
You weren't close enough to ground zero.
Yeah.
But there are like a ton of, since that time that the tabernacle was built, there's a lot of other temples around, scattered around.
Okay.
So I did have a temple closer, but yeah, it is very well integrated. And I mean, the church has been doing this for 150 years. So it's, they have a lot of practice, I'll
Yeah,
say.
they've gotten good at it. Yeah.
And I think like a lot of religions, it co-opts family relationships, right? It takes something that you already have and tries to repackage it and sell it back to you. So if you leave the Mormon church, you're no longer allowed to participate in marriage ceremonies. I haven't seen any of my siblings get married. You're not allowed to, like it becomes very messy for a lot of people. Like some people, their spouse will divorce them, or they lose custody of their kids, or if you work in any way with the church, you lose your job. So it can be very, very hard to extricate yourself from the church, even if you are not a believer. And to answer Craig's question from earlier, I am the Mormons still consider me a Mormon. Because I haven't formally resigned my membership. And the reason that I haven't is because my dad and my stepmom care a lot and I don't give a shit. And also, like, if I stop going to the Stop and Shop grocery store, I'm not going to write a letter to Stop and Shop and be like, I resign. like
I don't care about your store enough to go there anymore.
I'm just not gonna go.
Yeah.
And
That's awesome.
it is still my dream to get excommunicated from the Mormon church for writing a book.
We're trying to help you out with that, all right?
Yeah. I super appreciate it, because like the rabbit hole goes deep. So I've been very interested in like one little segment of Mormon history and like kind of trying to suss out these issues of belief, because even though I am, 12 or 15 years out from my disaffection, like I still, like it's still a question that I struggle with, like how I believed for so long, why I left, and it becomes something that it's like a defining moment in your life.
So that's a good segue, Leanna.
To
Maybe we should,
times.
yeah, to what, so it was when you were in Florida, roughly age 21. So where did the cracks first start to appear? What kind of, was the harbinger of that? And how did that pan out?
Okay, so when I was in grad school in Florida, unmarried Mormons are put into congregations with other unmarried Mormons. It's called a singles ward. And your goal in the singles ward is to get married, right? And so I was put into one of these congregations in Florida, and I had been in these congregations before. And I've always hated it. I think it's ridiculous. Like, it's stupid. It's like a meat market. You have like the ward directory that has like pictures and but in Mormonism, you aren't like a whole person unless you're married. Like all of my sisters were married by 19 and having babies. Oh, that's another like method of, right? If you're like worried about your babies, you don't have time to like research church history. Okay, so I was in the singles ward, which I hated anyway. And the people that were telling me, the men that were available to me were not appealing to me at all. And that was really hard because like it always comes back to your like lack of faith. Like if I had more faith, I would be married and happy. And, any two faithful Mormons can get married and have a happy marriage is what you're taught. So I really struggled with that a lot. I started teaching feminism. I taught a women's studies course as like a teacher's assistant, and my parents came out to see me, and my stepmom was like, after the class, because they came in to see me teach, after the class, she said, well, you're not really a feminist, are you? And I'm like, yes. And she's like, okay, but not like really, not like one of those, because in the 90s, one of the prophets of the Mormon church said that the three biggest enemies of the church are gays,
Oh boy.
feminists, and intellectuals. So
Oh my
like,
God.
you
Of
don't want to be.
course.
The Holy Trinity or unholy
Yeah,
Yeah,
Trinity.
no, that's the Trinity.
Yeah,
I
geez.
see, yeah.
So
God.
I was apparently dabbling in feminism, which is
Yeah, it's as bad as,
It's like
you
Satanism.
may as well
in
be
my
a
world.
Satanist, yeah.
I was like,
Where's the baby sacrificing coming in?
you know, I was resisting like the box that they wanted to put me in to like go and get married and have babies and be like a Mormon. And
So,
I,
Leanna, let me interject there. So, I'm assuming though that the where you were teaching this class, clearly you had begun to think, alternative thoughts before you did that. So, how did you get to the point from being a very good, faithful Mormon to being a feminist who's
um,
teaching a class? I'm assuming that's in grad school, right?
I'd be curious to know, were there any beliefs that you like held that were cracking, or was it more just
Yeah, and how?
social? Was it the social element, that the anxiety about the marriage and that stuff that started you on that trajectory, or was it ideas?
so
Hmm.
it was I when I became a teenager, I was a very early developer. So I had like hips and very large breasts. And in a conservative religion, you are taught that you are responsible for like what men think about you, and you cannot incite lustful feelings. And I was scolded on a fairly regular basis for what I wore, even if it was the same as what other people wore, because on me it looked more revealing. So from the time I was 12 years old, I was fighting against that. And not like, my sisters and my mother were very supportive of me and like, trying to navigate this space. But the the kind of tension between being a female who doesn't fit into the mold and who rejects the definitions that were put on me, and in some ways like plays with those. Like I would wear a dress with a skirt that was slit like more than I should have had it slit, and like I would also like you have to do these like goals as a Mormon woman, which is, learning how to sew and learning how to can and all this shit. And when they would ask me about my goals, I was like, oh, I want to grow my hair long enough so I can run around naked and still be all covered up. And they were like,
And that was a joke, right?
yeah, no, I mean, it was a joke, but it was also like, I was a very provocative,
They
more
took that seriously.
teenager. Yes.
Well,
And
that's my goal now. I am so eager
Chad, I've been trying
to
for
have
so
hair that
long.
long. Yeah,
I've been
Craig, you're
trying
right.
for
Just
so
talking to-
long.
Grow the beard long enough that you can cover everything.
It's just not working, man. It's
I
just...
think that's a great idea. But yeah, so there was a lot of tension,
Oh.
and especially when I went to BYU, because at BYU I was an English major, and in any other university, all of your upper division courses are going to be 90% female. But at BYU, that is not the case, because if women get married and then they drop out of school to support their husband because they're not going to be working, they're going to be raising babies. So like
Right.
I was like, I had teachers that were, I was too outspoken as a Mormon woman, like from the get-go. And there are a lot of outspoken Mormon women who like just struggle in that space. But I really pushed back, and I pushed back pretty hard, especially when I got to Florida, when I was, every year you were interviewed by your ecclesiastical leader about belief, where they ask you very pointed questions about like your contribution of tithing, which has to be 10% of your gross income, your sexual practices, including masturbatory practices. Like you have a serious interview with an ecclesiastical official every year. I think it's every 2 years now, but every Mormon adult goes through this. And when one of my last interviews, I was talking about like what I was doing at college, and my bishop said, "You're not reading anything that disagrees with the church, are you?" And I'm like, and I had to like take a step back because I'm like, okay, well, like what disagrees with the church? Like fucking evolution. Like I'm reading things about women's lived experience and how the world is like it's a different lens of seeing the world based on gender and our unconscious biases. Like this, but it is something I guess that disagrees with the church, but like so does fucking War and Peace, you know?
That's right.
Like where are we drawing these lines? And my bishop like could not answer that question. I also had a couple of incidents that like reinforced my continuing to distance myself from the church. One of those was there were, I mean, I'm adorable and I was a super hot commodity as like an unmarried 21-year-old. And there were two.
She still is, by the way, Chad.
I know, I'm not 21. It's been a long time since then. But there were two guys who both liked me, and you're supposed to like consent. Like you should always say yes to a date kind of thing as a Mormon. And
Really? Wow.
there were two guys, and there was an incident where like one of them had brought me, you know, some of his barbecue, and the two of them were like engaging in this posturing behavior over me, and like I shouldn't have even been there. Like it was not about me. It was
You
about
weren't
like, their
relevant.
weird-
Yeah.
And like I didn't
Wow.
even like either of them enough to like care. And meanwhile, I'm like in this very uncomfortable situation because of how, you know, just the dating and the pairing off. And I was like, this is terrible. I don't want any part of it. And I was also like reading, I mean, I was an English major, and so I wasn't, you know, studying science or anything, but what I was doing is looking at primary sources and being able to like evaluate reliability and thinking about, you know, how you can tell something is reliable historically, and also like just different ways of thinking about it, analysis, all of that. So all of that is kind of like bubbling inside of me. And
Close reading doesn't help either.
close reading doesn't help. Oh, and I also did a paper about the history of the compilation of the Bible. And so like what
Good
was
for you.
included, what wasn't, and how that, I mean, look, I was totally unprepared for grad school, but what I did have is I was the only one in my class that knew the Bible backwards and forwards. So I'm like quoting the King James all the time, and people are like, oh yeah, you're totally getting these references that were not in Milton. So that was really good. But
By the way, Leanna, just to interject, Chad has a doctorate in comparative literature.
I am so jealous.
Yeah,
I couldn't get into the doctorate program, so you must have been a better scholar than I
He was
was.
he was at Rutgers.
Yeah, I was at Rutgers.
So as all of this is percolating inside of me, I get asked out by a non-Mormon. Dun dun dun.
Oh, no. At Brigham Young? Or
No,
this later?
This is in Florida. You're in
University of
Florida.
Florida, yeah. And I was like super flattered by this guy's attention. And as I'm telling, like I told my stepmom about it, and she was like, you cannot date a non-Mormon.
Wow.
I was like, okay, but like, why? And she's like, you cannot take the risk that you will.
But he's hot.
The ultimate comeback.
In retrospect, this guy like ruined my life. So but not because he wasn't Mormon.
Right.
But so as I like started dating a non-Mormon, which is super frowned upon, he was very interested in religion. So I picked up one of the books that he had that was about the history of the Mormon church from the secular perspective, which I had never read before. Not ever.
No.
Because you don't do
wow.
that, because it makes you feel bad, and that's Satan like trying to lead you astray. So I read this book, and this guy was like annoyed because I was not paying attention to him at all. I was like in the book, and I got home and it crossed my mind, what if the church isn't true? And it was the first time that I'd really like allowed myself sit with that.
And that's your age 21 at this point, right?
Yes, this was the summer of 2005, I think. Summer of 2005. So maybe I'm almost 22. I'm pretty
So
sure.
that's really the kind of like the first crack where you're kind of given a perspective from the outside looking at what you've grown up with, essentially.
Yeah. You cut out a little bit, right?
Yeah,
there.
you cut out.
Yeah, no, what I was saying was that book, and this obviously the course of study that you were engaged in were, but especially the book, it sounds like, kind of nailed it. This is giving you the outside perspective on the life you've been leading.
And it was very well sourced. It was like written like an academic paper that I had been reading.
This is scholarly or academic work, maybe.
This is scholarly. I mean, it's like evangelical scholarly, but still like way more rigorous than anything that the Mormons are doing.
It's written by an evangelical, like attacking the Mormons?
There are so many like pamphlets and books.
Oh, sure, yeah, and I'm aware of that, but that's what it was. It wasn't just sort of a. So they had that an axe to grind.
Yeah, a little bit, but they didn't like really grind it until the end.
Okay.
But it went very quickly after that. So I was in my last semester of graduate school, and I had lived in Florida 18 months as a very faithful Mormon, and then it was like the walls came crashing down. And I think it was that night I called up the only ex-Mormon that I knew. It was someone that I had met in passing a year ago. And I called up this woman who I had not spoken to since. And I was a disaster. Like, I was crying, like she could barely understand me. I was like, and what if the church isn't true? And like, blah, blah, blah. And she was
like, why did I give this person my phone number?
And she was like, why don't you come over to dinner? And I'm like, that sounds great. So I had a conversation with them. And at this point, like, I knew what, so I had learned some things about the church, namely to do with Joseph Smith and the early Mormon church, which, like I told you before, is very glossed over in your faithful Mormon teaching. So I learned like some of these things that the church had glossed over, but what really hurt the most is that the church lied about all this stuff. So the church is super demanding of your time, 20 hours a week ish, and your money, 10%, and your profession of belief, and letting some creepy old man ask you about your masturbatory practices, and they demand complete transparency and complete honesty. And if you lie to your ecclesiastical leader, you are lying to God. And I find out that the Mormon church not only didn't tell me the truth, that they hid the truth from me and demonized the people who tell the truth, like excommunicated. And that was such
You're killing me. Yeah.
It was such
it's betrayal, complete betrayal.
I mean, huge betrayal. And I tell people that, like, my mother died of cancer when I was 15 years old, and it took 2.5 months from the time that she was diagnosed with cancer to the time that she died. And that was a terrible time. And I was 15 years old, and that's a terrible time to lose a mother. And my father was checked out because, like, he had his own problems, and it was a terrible situation. It was awful. And leaving the Mormon church was worse. Like, I did not evangelize because it was such a terrible experience to go through that betrayal. And so I talked to this woman and her husband, who they had a bunch of kids, and they left the church when their older kids were like teenagers. So the older kids repudiated their parents because, you know, leaving the church is a horrible thing to do, and how dare you betray God like that. so I was able to talk to in real life people about like their experiences, and they gave me like the letter that they had written to their family, and kind of laying things out. And I had a couple of drinks of wine with them, which was a first, and that was really nice because Mormons aren't allowed to drink wine. And I slept over at their house, and they were a huge support to me, like through the, especially like the initial phase, because I was supposed to, like, I skipped class for this because I was an emotional wreck, and that was like super unusual for me. So after the acute like betrayal, which lasts, it can last any amount of time, but mine was like 48 hours. And then I'm like, well, oh shit, I guess I got to research this. So as is very common for Mormons who leave the church, I started reading, and forget the 20 hours a week that you spend on Mormonism. Ex-Mormons spend like 40 or 80 hours a week, like just reading message boards, which at the time was the Recovery for Mormonism board, was the biggest thing out there. That it was like this janky, like 90s, terrible, but this great message board.
One of the early internet boards.
One of the early internet boards. And also just like trying to find the real church history, because it's such a trying to like suss out what actually happened and what the truth was. And the layers, like I have been out of the church and like very active in researching, and I am still peeling back layers of fresh fuckery that has gone on. So I spent, oh man, it was probably 2 years where I was all of my free time. It was like 30 or 40 hours a week. I was reading books and participating in message boards and trying to get that support. And I was lucky because like in the 80s, if you left the church, like you were completely isolated. But as the internet started getting going, you have a lot of support from various factions in this ex-Mormon world. And you also have a lot of support where there was a board called New Order Mormons, which was like the kinder, gentler version. By the way, the church does not allow for any like cafeteria Mormonism. You like believe or you don't. It's very binary. And if you profess belief in non-standard things, like you will get punished or demonized. But
so in other words, there's no like Orthodox, ultra Orthodox, liberal, reformed, like you have in
not officially.
Judaism.
Not officially. Yeah,
but
that's nice. Yeah.
This secret like New Order Mormon, which sounds so like nefarious, but it was
Sounds
really
scary.
I know, but really it was like bishops, like leaders who had discovered that the church is bullshit and try to like help others while still staying married to a believing spouse, and trying to work from within to make things easier for other Mormons who are leaving or having this crisis of faith. So I spent about 2 years at that, and I was very glad that I was in Florida and later in Spain, because then I didn't have the family pressure. And the one thing that I will say about the family pressure, like after I left the church, most of my siblings followed me out. Not followed me, but like found their own path out.
Sure. They were inspired by you perhaps, or realized.
I am super inspirational.
I agree, but yeah. Okay. Do you think that I was actually going to ask that. This is a little bit out of step with what we, the trajectory we had planned, but what would you say the impact was on your family, on your
good question.
Okay, so
what did they say?
What was the response, the kickback from all this?
So I never went to my family and was like, the Mormon church is completely bullshit and you should get out of there because it's terrible.
The frontal assault.
I never did that. I like quietly like moved to Spain. Who
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So a lot of the response was silence because, whatever. I did have one of my sisters asked me, how can you leave the Mormon church knowing that you won't be able to see our dead mother after you die? And I was like, huh,
Right.
okay, that's like, she has since left the church and she's like, I am so sorry that I said that to you.
Wow.
I'm like, fair. I get where you're coming from. One of my sisters wouldn't let me see her kids for a couple of years because I'm an evil apostate. And I believe in Tyrion Lannister when he says, wear it like a badge so that people can't make you ashamed. So
Yeah.
Excellent.
when my father would like try to talk around it and like my loss of faith, I'm like, Dad, I'm an evil apostate. It's okay, you can say it. And that makes him super uncomfortable. But
They all laugh nervously.
yeah, well, because they never know what I'm going to say next. So that's kind of fun.
As the horns grow out of her head.
I will say that like if I would have been confronted with my mother and her like crying, wanting me to stay in the church, like maybe that would have been enough to get me to stay, maybe. But my mom was dead, and my stepmom, who is a very faithful Mormon still, was a little bit more hands off, as a stepmother sometimes is, and so she didn't confront me about it. And my father confronting me about it was like, and I was like very soon out of my teenage years at this point. And so like my dad was like very hands off all the time, except when like you did something wrong and then all of a sudden he has an opinion. And like he would get mad at me for like complete bullshit. Like as I was going down to BYU, he talked to me because I was wearing a shirt that when I like reached all the way over the counter, you could see this much skin. And he talked to me about my immodesty. And I'm like, Dad, I'm going to fucking BYU, which is like the highest standards of immodesty. And second of all, like, okay, that's fine. And he did talk to me. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, he and my stepmom both talked to me about my disaffection after I got back from Spain. So I had, been wrestling with these topics internally for maybe 2 years.
How long were you in Spain, Leanna?
Like 20 months or something, 2 years.
So that's how you learned Spanish, huh?
Yeah, no, I knew
Okay.
I studied Spanish all through school.
But I mean, I didn't realize, because she was over at our house last night to watch a Halloween movie.
It was amazing.
We had a good time, but one of the movies was it's a Spanish, it's not really a horror movie. It's kind of a macabre sort of, what was the word?
Civil War.
Yeah, it's based in the Spanish Civil War. Anyway, so I was like, oh, you can, Spanish? And she starts blabbing away in Spanish. I was like, I didn't know this.
Yeah. So when my dad and my stepmom confronted me about it, I was very open and very direct, which Mormons are not conditioned to handle. Like when a Mormon would ask me something and I would say no, period. Like that's something like, are you going to go to church because blah, blah, blah. Or like, we've missed you at church. You really should go back. And I would be like, no, thanks. I'm all set. And like Mormons are not prepared to handle
No conversation stopper.
Yeah. And so my dad and my stepmom at like one of our trips up to the cabin talked to me about my disaffection, and I laid it out very kindly and gently and lovingly, because I know like what a horrible experience it is to go through this like crisis of faith. But I talked to them, I like picked one issue, and my one issue was Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the Mormon Church. And a lot of women, by the way, struggle with the polygamy in the church's past, but they put it on a shelf and they don't think about it. And that's actually what you're taught to do. You put it on a shelf.
Does Brigham Young fit into that to some degree? Like,
yeah,
because
I mean,
you've talked a lot about Joseph Smith. I'm just a little surprised I haven't heard you mention Brigham Young at all.
I mean, Brigham Young was a whole nother asshole. But we can
Okay.
talk about that in just a minute if you want
No,
to.
no, no, please. Yeah. Go
Um,
to traffic here. No,
but when so I chose the issue of polygamy with Joseph Smith and talking to them a little bit, and it wasn't a very long conversation. But I was like, you might be okay with the fact that the founding prophet of the Mormon church took sexual advantage of his teenage flock and sexually coerced 14-year-old girls. And I am not okay with that. You might be okay with that, but that is a deal breaker for me.
And what was
So,
their typical response to this?
wow, that's heavy, man.
I mean, what are you gonna say to that? You know,
Well,
Unreal.
you're in a car or you're in a house in a room. It's not like they can't run away. What are they going to say? I mean,
well,
change
and
the topic. Or
yeah, I mean, they like, and I
what
did.
movie have you seen lately?
I also didn't. I didn't get defensive. I didn't like what I was very like calm and dispassionate about it. And so I think that helped a little bit. But they also, like my dad, when he would question my like, because you're not supposed to have premarital sex as a Mormon, right? And I would be like, Dad, it's not premarital sex if I never get married. And he was like, super
That's
uncomfortable, right?
like
Or when he asked me about he asked some other like very pointed question about like underwear and sexuality, and I was like, Dad, if you want to know the answer to these questions, I will tell you, but make sure that you want to know before you ask me.
Did he stop?
Wow.
Yeah, he stopped.
Yeah,
Oh my
good for you.
goodness.
It's a really insightful thing you did there.
That is.
Yeah.
So I've come to a very, I mean, look, my dad was pretty upset with me for a lot of years because I left the church and then 4 of my 5 brothers and sisters followed me out. There's
Wow.
only
And he
one
blames you for that? Does he actually?
a little bit, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I
Wow.
bet. Yeah.
I mean, what am I gonna do? So there is only one
It
sibling.
is kind of your fault, mostly.
I mean, you know, I'm an evil apostate. I'm
Yeah.
like, whatever.
Yeah.
I wore the dresses with the slit on the side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was your
Too
destiny.
Too much skin.
So much skin. So I where was I going with this? Oh,
Your siblings. I kind of wanted to get to your. I was curious how that.
Yeah, the family response.
okay. So my other siblings, when they got far enough down their own disaffection, came to talk to me.
Oh,
And
I
I would talk to them about it when they were ready to hear, and when they approached me. Like I never approached any of my siblings except
did they go all separate ways? Like, did they have their own individual path and then come together, or?
Yeah, mostly like 2 of my sisters who got married at 19, and they like checked off all the boxes, and then their life fell apart, and they're like in terrible situations that they have to extricate themselves from and like get a divorce and all of that.
Oh, so it ended up ruining their family lives. And
so my
Wow.
sisters like found their own ways out of the church, but then came to talk to me, and found their ways out of the church based on belief, I would say, maybe more than like the history. And one of my brothers, after I got back from Spain, he was dating this woman, and
Wow.
I went out to dinner with this woman who I love, and she said to me that a lot of Mormon men who like fall away from the church, once they have kids, they'll go back because it's, you know, how they were raised and how they want to raise their kids with the values. And Natalie said, that is a deal breaker for me. I will not raise girls in the Mormon church, not ever, not once, not ever. So if your brother's going to go back to church, like I cannot continue this relationship. Like, what do you think? Do you think your brother would do that? And I was like, you know what? I haven't talked to him about this. Why don't you let me talk to him? So me and him took a trip up to my parents' cabin, and we started that car ride. And I said, hey, Alec, did I ever tell you why I left the Mormon church? And so we had a nice weekend, and then I came back and I said to Natalie, he is never going back to church. And she said, okay, good. I'm glad to hear it.
And he never did. He's A-okay, free and clear.
Yeah, he has 2 girls that he's raising out of the Mormon church, and like blissfully happy, living his best life. So yeah, that's the only sibling that I take partial credit for, because I was like, oh, have you heard about this? And what about this? And what about this other thing that you never learned about? And he's like, like I had heard like some about all of these things, but I showed him like the put together puzzle.
Was it weird to you that you all of a sudden realized there was an outside world that knew all this stuff, and you were living in a bubble in a world where nobody knows this stuff or knows this stuff? Was it weird to see it? Like, what was that moment like, perspectively or whatever?
So most of it is like apathy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
most of the world like doesn't give a shit about
Right.
Mormons or
Right.
what they believe, like in some
Sure.
weird in Utah. But
Except for
yeah,
the evangelicals.
yeah, no,
Well, no,
Yeah.
and there are academics who study this stuff, and people, atheists who want to expose
Sure,
it
yeah.
and rescue people, right? From
Well, and
yeah.
also just the history of American, religious culture. You'd have to include the Mormons.
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was, I mean, it was an education. Also, can I like call a timeout and like grab a drink and take a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
break
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
we can
yeah.
continue?
By all
Please.
means, yeah.
1 minute?
Are we taking? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
can stop the recording here.
Maybe would you mind just a
So-
little bit of a wind up after, just with the three of us once we're done recording? I just have some other stuff I'd love to ask you real quick.
Yeah,
On a
that's
personal
totally
level.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Leanna, so we're kind of wondering now, like, so you went through this transition and then you actually started deconverting your own family members. So where have you sort of wound up? Like, what would you say is your worldview now? I mean, to the extent that you can or want to describe it.
You call it disaffected. Can I quickly address that? It's interesting because in my world, you talk about deconversion, but you're an intentional person, and I know you're using language very calculatedly. I can tell. So why is that the chosen term for what you describe as you're leaving the community?
I mean, part of it is because the online world identifies as the disaffected Mormon universe, which
Oh,
stands
I
for
see.
That's the terminology they use, right?
Okay,
which
I
is
didn't know that.
terminology that they use. But it's also like, I don't know. For me, it has a lot of relationships to affect, because Mormons believe that they can see in your countenance if you are a believer or if you're faithful, and that you lose something from your countenance when you leave the church. So this like idea of affect, and it's also like much less, like a lot of people are like, what does that even mean?
Your glow is gone. I remember meeting Mormons overseas, and they smiled more than anybody else I've ever seen. Right. So you had almost like a Barbie doll, Ken Barbie feeling with these young people, and it seemed very calculated how they represented their face and their movements. And
Very
I know
interesting.
that sounds a little weird, but it seemed very clear to me that there was a built-in countenance measure happening. Right.
Yes. And it's also like, a lot of the words about like deconversion talk about your relationship to the church, and like disaffected seems like a step back from that,
It
because
does.
like it's not honestly, it has nothing to do with the church. Like the church is almost beside the point and
Interesting.
is not
Yeah.
a part of this belief journey that I've gone on, because they chose not. The church could have classes about these sticky subjects in Mormon history, and the church chose not to do that, and instead drive all those conversations underground. So
Yeah, right.
that's like the disaffection is removed
Nice.
from the formalness of the
I
church.
figured you had something calculated there. It just kept coming up in my brain because it stands out as a way of speaking about yourself from what I think most Christian people, how they talk about it. It is, deconversion feels right to me for some reason, but I'd love to ask that another time. Go ahead. So anyways, Craig, where did you want to head there?
So just kind of, you've kind of given us this journey, and then so where do you feel you have ended up? Like, if you can characterize and again, the time is entirely up to you how you want to.
We don't need your full epistemological.
Yeah, you don't need to give us a
system.
full download here, but to whatever extent you feel comfortable or you think it's discussable or.
Well, it's interesting because most Mormons who leave become pretty hardcore atheists because of this betrayal of trust. And that's because, and I'm a part of this, like, you cannot trust man's word on God. And even like man's interpretation of God. Like, I am so skeptical of any organized religion or anyone telling me what I should believe because of this huge betrayal. So I don't identify as religious, but it's not like I don't have the certainty of an atheist, or the anger of the ex-Mormon. To me, it's more like, wouldn't that be nice? Like, wouldn't it be nice if there's someone who's in charge of all of this and is going to fix this huge mess that we're in? Like, that's lovely.
Sure. Yeah.
But I do, in terms of like seeing the unknown, I've been researching this book that I want to write about 19th century Mormonism.
I was wondering if you're going to bring that up.
Oh my God, it's fascinating. My housemate will be like, I've heard enough about Nauvoo. I can't take any more Nauvoo. I've had Nauvoo up to here. So she puts a time limit on me. But it's like the rabbit hole. The rabbit hole is insane. But as a part of that, I'm researching the time period, which the 19th century folk magic was really common. I'm reading about the spiritualist movement. So this idea of how we talk about the unseen and how we talk about, the supernatural. And I would say that there is more, I believe that there is more than the tangible world that we talk about as reality. And I believe that relationships between people have a non-physical component that could be called holy, or our relationships to other people is like the closest I think you can come to God. But I don't believe in an embodied deity as such.
A person or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, if someone's sleeping on the job,
Yeah.
Well, got a lot to answer for.
Oh my God. Well, like, Mormons are taught that when you stand for judgment, Joseph Smith will be judging you. And
people have visions of Joseph Smith and Jesus together, and I've listened to an ex-Mormon talk about the visions he had when he was younger, around the time where he was talking about giving these testimonies where everybody cries and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's once a month, by the way.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so he talked about how he was so had this heightened sense of anticipation that this was all real, and he experienced a vision. He no longer believes it was a vision, but Joseph Smith and Jesus, he talked to them, right? So it's interesting.
Well, and I had experiences like you were taught to have that like burning fire of internal belief, right? And to chase out and record those experiences. So like after my mom died, the support of the community was a huge testimony builder, and like being able to see her again. I guess my supernatural experiences, I would get prayers answered, but like,
yeah,
I don't know what
sure
of that is chance and random. And I don't know, a lot of it was tied up in like family folklore and us being like for example, when I was growing up, I grew up on a subsistence farm in the middle of
Wow.
nowhere. And there was a day that we were all homesick and dad went to work and I was a baby and everyone is sick with the flu, sick as a dog, in their jammies, but I wouldn't stop crying. And because I wouldn't stop crying, mom had to get out of the house and we couldn't drive anywhere. So she went to the neighbors. And it turns out that the house was full of carbon monoxide poisoning. And if we wouldn't have left, dad would have come home to 6 dead kids and a dead wife. And so
Wow.
like, the family folklore is that there were angels that wouldn't
Sure.
leave me as a baby alone.
Right.
And so like there are experiences or, internal beliefs like that that I guess bolstered my faith. But
Those make it really sticky, don't they? Those are for some people really sticky moments in terms of being attached to their beliefs, I think.
yeah, well, and because Mormonism and religion in general and what politics is becoming is something that is so much a part of your identity that you can't extricate yourself from it. So when people
Right.
question the validity of this belief system, it's not the validity of this belief system over here, it's the validity of the belief system inside of you.
Yeah.
And when I left, like it was a huge identity crisis. Like I was
Yeah. Me too.
blown up into smithereens.
Yeah.
Which
I can relate to that.
yeah. I mean, I am more interested in like hearing about the Mennonites. Have you already done an episode on that?
No, because the Mennonite history, it was more evangelical. So the Mennonite history is one that I value, actually. I'm interested in learning more about, etc. But it wasn't the main thing. It was just Christian. I converted, spoken tongues, all of that stuff. So I was going to be a missionary, and I preached in the streets in Europe. I did all that stuff. I was very, very convinced, and I think most of my friends have found it maybe pretty bizarre to find out that I'm on this other side of the fence, and they generally don't want to talk to me about it.
That's really great. It sounds like you can identify with me.
Yeah.
How far into it are you?
Into what? Into
The disaffection, the
deconversion. That's a long time now. And that was a process that was, like the stock market. It was like this for years, even while I was married. As far as coming out of that world, it was super painful. It was ontological anxiety to the core. Like I had dissociative moments where I'd be with my friends and they kept expecting me to be my crazy self, Chad, do this, do that. Like I was supposed to be their funny person or whatever it was. And I couldn't even get outside of the bubble in my brain. I was so locked in. I thought I was dying. I thought I had lost myself to Satan, right? It was bone crushing, but I couldn't be dishonest. I needed to I couldn't say, well, I believe and feel entirely good about it. So I was craving honesty and I didn't have words. So the first words that came to me that allowed me to be honest were, I don't know. And as soon as I found those words, oh my God, I cried, right? Like, it was just such a relief to find words that were really true, that weren't tainted by some feeling like there was something wrong with it that I couldn't quite identify.
Religion needs to fear the truth seekers.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. So
we are the truth seekers.
I want to let you go because you've spent a lot of time with us. I'm super grateful. This was really rewarding. One last question.
Yeah.
If there were, I'm going to be more specific than our question that we had sent you, is what if you had some message or some idea for Mormons who would be interested in understanding your experience more, what belief, what way of thinking, what would you encourage them to think about? Is there any belief that you think is important or any idea that you'd like to send off to the world on that? before we end this?
So for any Mormon going through this similar process, I would say that just take your time with it. Like read the things that support Mormonism and read the things that don't support Mormonism, because our prophet teaches that truth can withstand scrutiny. And our prophets have said that if our religion can be destroyed by facts, then it deserves to be destroyed. And
Wow.
that is at the core of Mormonism, is this seeking greater light and knowledge. That was Joseph Smith's whole thing when he went into the grove and prayed, which like there's a lot of complications with that story, but like he was seeking further light and knowledge. And you don't always get to pick where your investigations take you, but you do get to pick being open and honest, and being able to hold contradictory ideas inside of us. And I think that if there are any Mormons listening about that are going through this disaffection process, there's no hurry. Like you
Don't
can
panic.
decide something today and decide something else tomorrow, and you can take your time with the process.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having letting yourself talk to us, or being here with us. This was awesome. I'm super
Yeah, thank you. This was like better than therapy, man.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
Well,
I'm still choked up, and I was almost losing it there a couple times. Thanks. Yeah.
I think, Leanna, I think it would be great because like Chad was kind of hinting there, is there's a lot of parallels between the two of you. Because like when I first met Chad, you were still kind of, you were
Mennonite.
on, he was not identifying as Christian, but you were definitely in a kind of flux there where you were not really quite sure how to think of yourself, as far as I can recall. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yes.
yeah. And so I've kind of, he and I have dialogued so much over the years. Most of it we're hundreds of miles or thousands of miles apart, on the phone or whatever. But yeah, so I've kind of watched him kind of go through this whole process. And I think it'd be really cool if the two of you, maybe, in a future time, Leanna, if you want to come back, just kind of you compare notes, because there's just so many parallels here.
I would be totally open to that. I'm excited to see where this YouTube channel goes.
Yeah,
now
well,
I'm like personally invested.
Yeah. Well, we'd love to talk to you again, and thanks for being here. Hopefully we'll get a little chat after we close the door on this episode of the Cult of Conversation. Looking forward to more.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye, Leanna.
Bye.